The sun hung low over the Texas hill country that evening, casting long shadows across the dusty ground where Samuel Morrison had lived alone for the better part of 20 years. His weathered hands gripped the reins of his old bay mare as he made his way back from checking the fence line along the southern pasture. The wind carried the scent of sage and dry grass, reminding him of evenings long past when his wife Martha would wait on the porch with a glass of sweet tea and stories about her day tending the vegetable garden. Those days felt like a lifetime ago now. As Samuel approached the old oak tree that marked the boundary between his land and the neighboring spread, he noticed something that made him pull up short. There, tied to the trunk with rough rope, sat a young woman. Her dark hair fell across her face in tangled strands, and her clothes were torn and stained with what looked like dried blood. She was bound tight with her hands behind her back and a gag across her mouth. Samuel dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to move cautiously through life. His first instinct was to call out to her, but something in the way she held herself made him pause. There was fear in her eyes, yes, but also something else, a kind of resigned acceptance that spoke to years of hardship. As he approached, she looked up at him, and he saw past the dirt and the bruises to something that reminded him of his own daughter Sarah, who had left home 15 years ago after words were spoken that could never be taken back. "Easy now," Samuel said in the gentle voice he used with spooked cattle. "I'm not going to hurt you." He reached for his pocket knife and began cutting through the ropes that bound her wrists. The young woman flinched at first, but then seemed to understand that this weathered rancher meant no harm. When the last of the rope fell away, she pulled the gag from her mouth and spoke in a voice hoarse from thirst. "Please," she whispered, "don't judge me when you see." Samuel paused in his work of untying the ropes around her ankles. There was something in those words that carried the weight of 1,000 small rejections, the kind of phrase that comes from a lifetime of being turned away. "See what, child?" he asked, though his tone remained gentle. She pulled back the sleeve of her torn shirt, and Samuel understood. Her arm was marked with the telltale signs of needle tracks, old scars and fresh wounds that told the story of addiction and desperation. Samuel had seen enough of life to know that people carried their pain in different ways. He finished freeing her legs and helped her to stand. "What's your name?" he asked. "Rebecca," she said, barely above a whisper. "Well, Rebecca, I'm Samuel, and you look like you could use some water and maybe something to eat." She stared at him with disbelief written across her face. "You're not going to call the sheriff?" Samuel considered this as he helped her toward his horse in his younger days. He might have done exactly that, but the years had taught him that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the obvious thing. "Depends," he said, "on whether you're running toward something better or just running." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment as they walked. "I don't rightly know anymore," she finally admitted. The honesty in her voice reminded Samuel of conversations he'd had with his own demons over the years. The bottle that had once called to him during the darkest period, after Martha's passing. The nights when grief had driven him to seek numbness in whatever form he could find. "Well then," Samuel said as he helped her up onto his horse, "I reckon we've got time to figure that out." The ride back to the main house was quiet except for the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth and the occasional creak of leather. Samuel found himself thinking about the choices that led people to desperate places. Rebecca sat behind him on the horse, and he could feel the tension in her slight frame. Every few minutes she would look over her shoulder as if expecting someone to come after them. The ranch house came into view as the last light faded from the sky. It was a simple structure built by Samuel's grandfather with additions, made over the generations as the family grew and prosperity came and went. The porch light cast a warm glow across the front steps where Martha's old rocking chair still sat exactly as she had left it. Samuel helped Rebecca down from the horse and led her to the kitchen. He put the kettle on for tea and pulled out some leftover cornbread and beans from the icebox. "Go ahead and wash up if you need to," he said, pointing toward the small bathroom off the kitchen. "There's soap and clean towels." When she emerged a few minutes later with her face scrubbed clean and her hair pulled back, Samuel was struck again by how young she looked. 25, maybe 30 at the most, young enough to start over if she wanted to. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the kitchen wall. Samuel had learned over the years that sometimes the best gift you could give someone was the space to be quiet with their thoughts. After they finished eating, Rebecca finally spoke. "Why, are you helping me?" Samuel poured them both another cup of tea and considered the question, I suppose. He said slowly, "Because someone helped me once when I needed it most." He told her about the winter after Martha died, when grief had nearly broken him. How he'd lost himself in drinking and self-pity until his neighbor Jim Patterson had shown up one morning and simply started helping with the daily chores. No lectures or judgment, just presence and practical help, until Samuel found his footing. Again, Jim never asked me why I was drinking so much or told me I needed to pull myself together. Samuel continued. He just showed up every day until I was ready to start showing up for myself again. Rebecca listened with the kind of attention that comes from recognizing your own story in someone else's words. "The men who tied you up," Samuel said gently, "they coming back for you?" Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. "They might," she admitted. "I owe them money for the stuff I've been using." "How much?" $3,000. Samuel whistled low. That was more money than he usually saw in 6 months of ranching, but he'd been putting aside a little each year from the cattle sales. Money he'd been saving for repairs that never seemed urgent enough to tackle. "That's a considerable sum," he said, "but not impossible." Rebecca stared at him in shock. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious," Samuel replied. "But there's conditions." He explained that she could stay in the spare room that had once belonged to Sarah. She could help with the ranch work if she was able, and she needed to start thinking about what kind of life she wanted to build once she was free of the debt. "I can't pay you back," Rebecca said. Don't have any skills or education." Samuel smiled for the first time that evening. "Child, I've been ranching for 40 years, and I can tell you that the most valuable skill a person can have is the willingness to show up and try. Everything else can be learned." They spent the next hour talking about practical things, where she would sleep, what kind of work needed doing around the ranch, how they would contact the men she owed money to. But underneath the practical conversation was something deeper. The beginning of trust between two people who had both known loss and disappointment. The next morning, Rebecca was up before dawn helping Samuel with the morning chores. She moved carefully as if still testing whether this kindness was real or some kind of trap. But Samuel went about his routine with the same steady patience he brought to everything, feeding the horses, checking on the cattle-mending fence where needed. By midday, they had established a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Over the following weeks, Rebecca began to fill out as regular meals and honest work, restored some of her strength. Samuel paid off her debt through an intermediary, asking no questions about the transaction. He simply handed over the money and told the men that Rebecca was under his protection now. More importantly, he began to see glimpses of the person she might have been before addiction took hold. She was quick to learn and had a natural way with the animals. She could mend clothes with careful, precise stitches, and she had a gift for coaxing vegetables to grow in the kitchen garden that Martha had once tended. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk about small things. The weather plans for improving the ranch, stories from their respective pasts that felt safe enough to share. Samuel found himself looking forward to these conversations. It had been a long time since he'd had someone to share his thoughts with, someone who listened without judgment and responded with genuine interest. One evening, about a month after he'd found her, Rebecca brought up something that had been weighing on her mind. "Why didn't you have children of your own?" she asked. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. "We did," he said finally. "Sarah was born when Martha and I had been married about 5 years. He told Rebecca about his daughter, how she'd been bright and headstrong, how she'd wanted to go to college in the city despite Samuel's belief that everything worth knowing could be learned on the ranch, how their arguments had grown more heated until one night Sarah had packed her bags and left, how pride had kept him from reaching out even when Martha begged him to try. She wrote letters for a while," Samuel continued, "but I was too stubborn to answer them. Martha would read them to me sometimes about her job and her apartment, and eventually about the man she married. But I never wrote back, never told her I was proud of her, or that I missed her. His voice caught slightly as he continued. Martha died hoping I'd make things right with Sarah. But by then I didn't even know how to find her. Rebecca reached over and touched his weathered hand.